Today we're going to be changing the valve cover gaskets and spark plugs on this Lexus GS300 with a 3-liter inline 6 engine. Now the valve covers and spark plugs are located under this cover here, so we're going to need to remove this cover, as well as the air intake tube. So there's 4 10mm bolts to take off the engine cover, and then just lift off the engine cover. There's 4 hex bolts that hold on this engine cover. We're going to remove that next. And we're just going to pop off the cover. Next we need to take the air intake off. There's one clamp here that we need to remove, and then one clamp over here, and there's a vacuum hose here and one over here. One and the second one. Good idea to label all of your vacuum hoses and electrical connections so you know where they go. Alright, now that the intake pipe is off, we can then move to removing the throttle body. Alright, so to remove the throttle body, there's a number of electrical connectors and vacuum hoses that need to be removed. So from this side here, we need to remove this electrical connector, this connection here, the throttle body connection. There's another connector down here, so this entire wire harness can be freed. Then moving on over here, the wire that goes to the motor of the throttle body, vacuum hose here, coolant hose down here at the back, another vacuum hose over here, your throttle cable of course. There's this sensor here that has a 10mm bolt that needs to be removed, and there's also a hidden vacuum hose at the back here. And when you get everything loose, then you'll be able to take off this final coolant hose on this side here. Alright, so we pull out one electrical connector and another electrical connector, and take off your throttle body connector on the other side of the throttle body. Now in order to loosen this electrical harness, I'm just going to remove this nut right here, and then now this harness can move out of the way. And there's one electrical clip that we can remove to free up the harness a bit more. Okay, so to remove this green relay, it's just a 10mm bolt that holds it on. Alright, that bolt comes out, and then we can move the relay away from the plenum. Alright, now we're going to release the throttle cable. Just pull it back and remove the tab from the end of the cable. And next we need to undo the throttle cable from the throttle body. So it's a 14mm wrench. And then we can remove the throttle cable from the throttle body. And we're going to take off the PCV hose clamp. And then pull out the PCV hose. Sometimes it can be brittle, so you have to be careful. And use a clamp to take off this vacuum hose, and then pull off that hose. Alright, so we're going to squish the coolant tab and pull it back. Now we're going to remove the coolant hose. Some coolant's going to drip out. So now that we got all of the electrical connectors and vacuum lines free from the throttle body, we're going to be removing the throttle body from this side here going this way. There's 2 nuts on this side and a couple more bolts on this side. So over here on the throttle body side, you don't remove these 2 12mm at the top. You actually have to remove the 12mm bolts on the bottom that holds it to the engine. Remove the 12mm bolts. There you go. Now we're just removing the one towards the firewall. Alright, and we're just going to unscrew this nut. And that's it right there. Okay, so with both of those bolts removed, we're going to move over here to the intake plenum. Now there's 4 bolts here, 12mm, that need to be removed, as well as 2 of these nuts, one on this side and one over on the other side that's a bit hidden. Now these ratcheting wrenches come in handy for these smaller bolts that are down here. It's much easier to break them free. So this last nut on the bottom here is a little bit hard to get to. Again, we can get in with the flex head ratcheting wrench and break it free. Alright, we're going to remove the throttle body and intake assembly. First going to slide it off the studs. There is one vacuum line and one coolant line underneath. So we're just going to lift it up slightly and then disconnect that vacuum line over here. So here under the intake we've got one vacuum line to remove here, as well as this bolt here that holds those other 2 vacuum lines on. And then we also got this coolant line to remove with its hose clamp. Put the hose clamp back for that coolant line on the throttle body. Alright, so the last line to remove is this coolant hose. You just pop that off, and then we can remove the entire throttle body assembly from the vehicle. Next we need to free this wiring harness from this valve cover area. So there's one 10mm bolt and one connector here that we need to remove. So just use a flat screwdriver and release the tab from this connector, and the harness comes free. So there's one more 10mm bolt that pulls the harness on that we're going to remove. So now that this side of the wiring harness is free and this side of the wiring harness is free, next we need to remove this part of the wiring harness in order to clear for the valve covers. Next we're going to remove the 3 coil pack connectors that go to the engine wiring harness. You have to be careful with these because the heat makes them very brittle, and you're going to have to replace them if they break. As you can see, the first one's already broken. Alright, this is the second coil pack. We're just using a screwdriver to remove the tab, and that one didn't break. And then we're going to move to the back coil pack. This one's a bit hidden, and that one didn't break either. Next we're going to remove this plastic tab that holds the wire on. Here we go, got it. And then now this part of the engine harness can be pulled back. Next we're going to remove the spark plug wires. So that first comes out of that, and then remove it from the ignition coil. There's supposed to be a tab there, but that's broken. And then we're going to move on to the second set of spark plugs. So again, first remove the one from the spark plug. This is wasted sparks. And then we're going to pull out the last wire from the rear spark plug. Next we're going to remove this 10mm bolt over here that holds this ignition pack on. Then we're going to remove this 10mm bolt that holds the front coil pack on. That bolt comes out, and then we can remove the ignition coil from above the spark plug. Alright, once the plastic that's holding the wires comes out of the way, it then clears for your 10mm bolt that holds the middle ignition coil on. And then we can slowly pop off the ignition coil, which is really oily. Next we're going to remove the final 10mm bolt that holds the rear ignition pack on, and then remove the ignition pack from the rear spark plug. Alright, so everything's off, all the intake and the spark plugs. We're almost free to take off the valve cover gaskets. But if you zoom in here, you can see how much oil has been leaking in this car. You can see that all of the spark plug holes are wet, and it's been building up for a while with a lot of gunk between the spark plugs. So we're going to need to clean this out before we open up the valve cover gaskets or remove the spark plugs, because you don't want any gunk getting down inside of the engine. So just to clean out all the gunk in there before we remove the spark plugs, we're just going to use a vacuum and suck out all the debris. Alright, now that the spark plug tubes are clean, next we're just going to use a little bit of brake cleaner and clean out all the gunk from between the valve covers. Sometimes to clean valve cover gaskets, the best thing to use is your brother's old underwear. Okay, so I've got the area between the valve covers nice and clean. The next step, we can remove the valve covers. There's 8 10mm bolts on each cover. There's also 2 nuts at the back.
It's already loose.
Yeah, it's supposed to be loose.
Why?
Because it was leaking.
What a joke.
That one's loose. Okay, so now that all of the nuts and bolts are free from the valve cover, there's one stud under here and one stud back there that it needs to be lifted out from. And you also need to remove this wiring harness, pull it up a bit in order to get the valve cover out. We're just going to start by rocking it to break the seal, and then picking it up over the studs and removing it from the car. And there's the gasket as well. Alright, with the one valve cover off, you can see that when I put my screwdriver in there, there is a little bit of engine sludging that's going on with this engine. That shows that the person probably didn't maintain this properly and change the oil on time. So that was the intake cover off. Next we're going to tackle the exhaust cover. So there's 2 10mm nuts, one over here and one at the back there, and the rest are 10mm bolts that we're going to remove next. Okay, we're going to remove the exhaust cover. There's one stud on this side and one stud at the back there, as well as this wiring harness that we have to avoid. Just going to give it a rock to break it free. I don't think that's doing anything. There we go. There we go. And then clear the heater hose. Pull it out. That's it. Okay, so here's what it looks like with your intake and exhaust cam covers off. As you can see, this engine is a little bit dirty. Alright, so here are the cam covers. I can then remove the gasket. It just comes right out. This is the one that was leaking the most, the intake side. The older gasket's going to be a little bit more brittle. This one's not too bad. This is also an excellent time to replace the PCV valve, which is responsible for venting these valve covers back into the intake. Alright, so I'm going to clean both the inside and the outside of the valve covers. I'm going to use a little bit of engine degreaser for that. So it's just going to spray it on and let that soak in for a couple of minutes. Now you can also take your brother's toothbrush, spray a little bit of degreaser on it, and clean off some of that oily deposits from the inside of the cover. After the engine degreaser has been sitting for a while, then wash it off with some water. Alright, next we're going to use a little bit of brake cleaner on a paper towel and clean up the inside of the valve cover where the gasket seats. I'm going to use a little bit of brake part cleaner on a clean paper towel to clean the surface of the valve cover where the gasket meets. So here's the gasket set we got from Felpro. It comes with 2 driver's side gaskets and 1 passenger side gasket for whatever reason. I'm going to go ahead and seat the valve cover gasket into the valve cover. It's got a nice channel here where it fits in. Want to make sure that it's pressed in all the way so it seals properly. Alright, I've got the new gasket installed on both of these covers. You really need to make sure that the gasket is fully seated all the way around. Otherwise, if this lifts up, it can kink and cause a leak. I'm going to be using a little bit of RTV silicone that's good for automotive use to seal the corners of the valve cover where it meets the camshaft. I'm going to apply a little bit of RTV sealant around the corners here, and especially where it butts up against this half moon circle where the camshaft is. That's because the gasket sometimes has trouble sealing around these areas and it could cause a leak. So I'm going to use a little bit of sealant on my finger here and get in between the cam and a little bit more on this side. Next, we're going to replace the valve cover. And then once you seat it on the studs, we're going to wiggle it to make sure that it seats nicely. And then make sure we seat this onto the studs. And then once it's down, I'm going to press down to make sure that the gasket seats. Next, we're going to replace the 6 bolts and 2 nuts on each valve cover gasket. Once all the valve cover bolts are hand tightened, I'm going to next come in with my ratchet with a 10mm socket and start tightening down very loosely from the center and work my way outside towards the front and back of the car. So next we're going to torque the bolts to 75 inch-pounds. Again, we're going to start from the middle bolt and work our way to the outside, front and rear of the vehicle. So next we're going to replace the spark plugs on this car. So we've got our spark plug socket and we're just going to release that from the motor and unscrew the spark plug from the engine head. Alright, then we remove the spark plug, and as you can see it's very oily because of the leaking valve cover gaskets. So as you can see, this is the second spark plug I took out. It's also coated in oil. And you'll also notice that this is a double tip spark plug because this engine is a waste spark ignition. Here are the 6 spark plugs that came out of the engine from the front to the back. As you can see, these are probably original. This car has about 250,000 kilometers and they're worn out and due for a replacement. This here's the old spark plug versus the new spark plug. They're exactly the same model and they're both from Denso with the double electrode. Now, one tip to prevent these spark plugs from seizing is to use a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. You just want to put a light coating so that it goes in easier and it won't have trouble coming out next time you have to do a spark plug change. So then I'm going to install the spark plug into the engine, and then once they've all been started by hand, I'm just going to run them down with the ratchet very lightly. Next, I'm going to use my torque wrench and torque the spark plugs down to 156 inch-pounds or 13 foot-pounds. Alright, so we're trying to disconnect this old coil pack connector. We're just going to insert this needle into here, and then once that comes out, and then the entire thing gets freed from the harness. And that's it, the connector comes out. It's all in pieces, but now we're going to go ahead and replace these with a new connector so we don't have the same problem anymore. So this is what the new coil pack connector looks like. We got them off eBay. You'll need about 3 of these for the job if all 3 of yours happen to break. Alright, so we're just going to put in the new coil pack connector. The light brown wire, which is that one there, is pin 1, which is that one there. I'm going to go ahead and put that in. It just clips in like that, and that one clips in like that, and then the white part pushes in, and then there's the cover that goes on top. This is an excellent time to also replace the ignition wires. We've got an NGK wire set here, which is these ones in blue. We're going to go ahead and swap out that from these ignition coils here. So we're going to use a little bit of electrical contact cleaner to clean out this ignition coil from all the oil from the valve cover gaskets that was leaking. Here we've got 2 equal length wires, and over here we've got 2 equal length wires, but because this is waste spark ignition, the rear coil powers the front spark plug and the front coil powers the rear spark plug. So we need to transfer these brackets over to the new wiring harness. Now the middle plug, which is this one here, has a shorter wire, which is this one here that we can replace directly. Okay, so to undo these coil pack connectors, you have to use a screwdriver and lift up the tab, and then you can pull this top part off, and then the whole plug will come out like that. So now to replace the coil pack connector with the wire, just squish that in and put the new tab down till it locks, and that's it. So I've got my brand new blue wires attached to the ignition coils. Next I'm going to replace this into the vehicle. Next I'm going to replace the ignition coil onto the second cylinder. Now we're going to insert the rear coil on top of the rear spark plug, and then we're going to seat the rear wire, and then come over back to the front here. We're going to seat the front wire. Alright, next we're going to put in the middle ignition coil. And once that's seated, we're going to loop the wire around and put in the middle ignition plug. Alright, now we're going to insert the 10mm bolt that holds the ignition coil on. Make sure you put anti-seize on these because sometimes they get a little stuck when they come out. And we're going to tighten that down. Alright, so we've got the coil pack connectors installed as well as all the wiring. Everything's nice and tight. The next step is to put in the intake plenum. Alright, so before we put the air intake on, I'm going to give it a good clean both on this side here and inside of the throttle body here. We're going to be using a little bit of air intake and carb cleaner.
Do I need to take this out for something?
Then just use a rag and clean out all the carbon deposits. Now we're also going to spray inside of the throttle body side and use a toothbrush and a rag to clean it out. Alright, next I'm going to take the coil pack connector wiring harness and install them onto the coil packs. They just clip right in. And the one at the back here. And once the coil packs are in, we're going to secure the harness with these clips. That's it. Alright, we're also going to clean out the inside of the intake plenum. As you can see, it's got a lot of carbon deposits in the PCV system. So we're going to clean that out with a rag and some carb cleaner. Alright, we're also going to change out this gasket here, so I'm just going to use a flat screwdriver and pry it away. It's a metal gasket, and we're going to replace it with a new one. And we're going to use a little bit of brake cleaner to clean up the surface before we put on the new gasket. Alright, I've got the new gasket. It's from Felpro. I'm going to install that onto the studs. So before I put the intake on, just a reminder, we've got this green little relay here, the vacuum relay, with a vacuum hose that needs to go on. You've got another smaller hose over here, a small hose that goes under the intake plenum. Then of course on this side you've got your coolant hose. Now we're going to replace the throttle body assembly onto the engine. Alright, we've got the intake back in. So far I've got the little vacuum hose that's down here. We've got that back in. We've also got the vacuum hoses that are here, along with that vacuum switch plugged in and the coolant line over here. So all that's left is to bolt down the intake plenum here and over here on this side. And then a couple of electrical connectors over here, the throttle position sensor, the coolant line, and then another throttle cable back here. So next we're going to replace the 4 12mm bolts that hold the intake plenum on. Don't forget that there's that nut down there that needs to be tightened as well. And one more nut over on this side. There. Torque these down nice and snug. Now over here on the throttle body side, we're going to replace the throttle body bracket that holds it to the engine and 4 12mm nuts. And the other set of bolts for the bracket is at the bottom here. We'll just put that in. And we'll just tighten that down. Alright, next we're going to put in the throttle cable. We're going to use that 14mm nut, just tighten that up. And then we're going to install the throttle cable. Alright, next we're going to replace the coolant line that goes to the front of the throttle body. And that's it, the clamp is in. Next we're going to plug in this ventilation hose and its clamp. And then we're also going to plug in the throttle position sensor. Then we're going to plug in the throttle body plug. And then over here to this front plug here. Alright, now we're replacing the air intake tube from the air box over to the throttle body. And then once that's in, we're going to replace this hose at the back. And then we're going to replace this hose at the airbox. Alright, now we're going to start the engine for the first time and make sure everything runs properly. And of course it's going to run a little bit rough and hard to start because of the throttle body cleaner. Once we've made sure there's no leaks, we can replace the engine cover. The next step would be to degrease the engine and take it for a nice long test drive and check all of the valve cover gasket interfaces for leaks.